Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Marco Circapasta. I'm a housing specialist with the Welcome Home City program here at San Diego City College. I'm also with Path San Diego as a housing specialist. And I'm here today to talk to you guys about the San Diego rental market. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of housing in San Diego. I think that's important to cover, getting some context around how we got to where we are now and understanding the problems, how we can better look towards solutions. We'll also be talking about the current rental prices. Um, we'll be discussing renting from a landlord's perspective so that you'll have a better understanding of how you can present yourself when talking or advocating to a landlord. And then we're going to be talking about how to search for housing. So we're going to start out with history. We're going to go all the way back to post-World War II, around the population boom and our highways. So San Diego became a military/defense hub. Post-World War II, our population exploded. There was a big investment in defense. We're here on the coast, have a Navy and military bases around our coast. And there was a aerospace job growth as well. So even in the 1930s, we saw a bunch of people coming from around the country, but not enough houses for people to live in. So people lived in trailers in Balboa Park, even in the 1930s. And forever since San Diego's been around, our development strategy has been around single family houses designed around our highways. So there was no interest in any sort of urban development. We looked at New York and Chicago and said that we didn't want to structure our region like that. They looked at some of that high density development and saw it as an opportunity for more crime, more poverty. So they really, when they imagined the American dream, they always thought of it as a single family house with a lawn, car in the garage, and a white picket fence. So all of our development was around single family homes and it was very car centric. They were really looking towards the future, thinking that cars would be the primary mode of transportation, no reliance on public transportation, and that's how they designed the region. And then in the 1950s and 1970s, development expanded into North County, East County, and South Bay. And we built on every Mesa and Valley available until there was no longer any left. And then I want to touch on this very important topic of redlining and discriminatory housing practices. So minority housing disenfranchisement, basically talking about how minorities were excluded from housing throughout San Diego's history. The first one I want to talk about is racially restrictive covenants. If that sounds like a scary, old, racist thing, it's because it is. It's a legal document that came along with a deed that basically specified who can reside at a property based on their race. And a survey was done of some of the deeds between the 1910s and the 1950s, and we found that most of those deeds included a racially restrictive covenant. This was then outlawed in 1948, but the intention behind it was to create these white-only spaces. They used the guise of mixed race communities would devalue properties as an excuse for creating these white-only spaces. And that brings us directly into redlining. In the 1930s through the 1960s, the Federal Housing Act invested $120 billion into new housing, but only 2% of that went to non-white households. The reason for this is that the federal government looked to local real estate developers to design where these investments would go towards. So they created these maps, as you can see here, of areas that are in red, yellow, green, and blue. The red were considered high risk areas that should not be invested in. So that is another way that they were benefiting these white-only spaces while excluding communities of color. And then going more into modern day forms of discrimination, NIMBYism, generally the idea, it's not in my backyard is what it stands for, but it generally refers to people who say, you can develop, but don't develop anywhere near me. But when you have a group of folks across the region who say that they don't want you to develop around them, then development is obstructed everywhere. So they oppose new development and density. This has become a bigger problem since the 1950s when California amended their state constitution, Article 34. It now requires voters' approval before building any sort of public housing in a community. And many times you'll hear things like neighborhood integrity, people thinking that any more density in their neighborhood will bring, again, crime and poverty, a lot of the same things that we saw earlier. So these are all very important things to know in San Diego's history. NIMBYism is very prominent today. So understanding kind of its roots, you can talk more about it if it's being addressed in community members. I can give an anecdote that I see signs for no on Senate Bill 10 in my own neighborhood, and that's no on SB 10 is an anti-development platform. You see people protesting new developments. So being educated on, where this is originally coming from and how you can kind of maybe speak to it and say, hey, this is actually not, has racist origins, and this idea of neighborhood integrity is inherently racist and classist. So it's important to know. And then we're moving along to the 1970s and 80s. This is when we, again, were developing all of those mesas and valleys. The last time we had sufficient housing was when we had many square miles of mesa tops we could develop. That's a quote from Stephen Russell, the executive director at the San Diego Housing Federation. And I believe it was in the 1970s that San Diego's housing price was in line with the national housing price. I think since the 1970s, it's been greater than the national average, and in the past probably few decades, it's been in the top 10, 5 most expensive housing markets in the country. And you can kind of see here how the development took place in places like Mira Mesa, a lot of suburban sprawl, Scripps Ranch, Rancho Penasquitos, Carmel Valley. You can see that it really spread out across the available land to build on. And a lot of that was single family homes. So one individual household living on a single piece of property. Multifamily homes would be something like an apartment, condo, or townhouse where multiple families can live on a single property. And then I want to talk about COVID, because COVID really did have a large impact on housing as it is today. So rental criteria and remote work. So unpaid rent caused stricter rental criteria. By mid-May 2020, more than 400,000 people in the San Diego region were out of work and unable to pay their bills and rent. The local government's eviction moratorium was meant to protect those who weren't able to pay rent, but it meant that landlords couldn't either collect on rent and they couldn't remove people who weren't paying. So after those COVID protections ended, evictions reached a 5-year high. And then landlords increased the income and rental criteria needed to be able to be approved for an apartment so that they can avoid any sort of future risks. This is where you see 2.5 and 3 times income required, solid rental history, high credit scores, and it's all for the landlords to avoid any sort of risk of non-payment in the future. And then this was also a time where people were starting to work remotely. So people could keep their jobs where they were at, but move down to San Diego and enjoy our weather, our beaches, and our tacos. This was specifically a big thing in San Francisco. People were keeping their tech jobs, moving down here. And you can imagine that would make our rental market, it can increase prices because there's more demand and it's going to be more competitive. And then the rise of San Diego's rental prices, inventory and demand. So our population has continued to grow, but development has halted. Our housing development has lagged behind permitting goals for over 20 years. So every year we're supposed to be creating a certain amount of housing, but over the past 20 years, we haven't met those goals, but our population has continued to increase. land needed to build on has become extremely expensive. Of course, that's because we've already kind of built on all of those mesa tops. We've got the Pacific Ocean to our west, kind of the LA region to our north, Mexico to our south, and the desert and mountains to our east. So all of that land that would be able to be built on has already been used for single family homes. So when that land is extremely expensive, that means that developers are only interested in building luxury housing on top of it to get more return on that development. House buying prices have skyrocketed, which means that more of the middle and high income households that would normally be owning a home are now in the rental market with the rest of us. So it again increases competitiveness. Wages not keeping up with housing costs are also making anything that's affordable more competitive. So if you see a studio apartment listed for $1,500, you could definitely apply to it, but know that maybe 30 to 50 other people might be applying to it as well. And then another big important thing is that large investment firms see San Diego as an opportunity to buy properties for either flipping, renting, or as a way of kind of artificially inflating housing prices. So what they'll do is they'll buy several properties within a neighborhood and then sell one for a higher price than the rest, and then it increases the value of all the surrounding houses. And these are some graphs kind of illustrating just how the situation has unfolded. Here you can see there was this last spike in 1986 of housing developments, but it's really lagged ever since. So where previously around 3% of San Diego's housing came from new homes, now less than 1% comes from new homes. Housing development stagnates. We need around 12,000 units to support our population growth, and we've lagged behind that for many years. And again, it's not just that housing isn't being built, it's that the housing that is being built is very unaffordable. You can see here that under 3,000, over the 7-year period, under 3,000 units were built for very low income folks, yet 42,000 were built for above moderate income households. So that is a very big problem and the reason why it's so hard to find something that's affordable. And here's a graph kind of just showing the the widening gap between our population and available housing. And that kind of leads us to where we are now, where San Diego now has the 3rd highest rent price in the nation. This was in July, where we had just beat out San Francisco as one of the least affordable rents. I think since then, they caught back up, and I think we're around 5th highest in the nation as of this point. You can get a sense for what the fair market rates are for studio apartments. It's around $1,700, 1 bedrooms around $1,900, 2 bedrooms almost $2,400, and it goes up and up. But that's also different than what you see in the actual market. So the median rent for a studio apartment is closer to $1,900. For a 1 bedroom, it's closer to $2,300. And then for a 2 bedroom, it's closer to $3,200. So you can see how the difference between fair market rate and the reality of what people are asking for. These graphs show a little bit of the breakdown of available rental properties. So you see that around 1% of things that are listed are between $700 and $1,000 a month in rent. 2% of the inventory is between $1,000 and $1,500, and 7% is between that $1,500 and $2,000. 90% is over $2,000. Around 52% of all of the housing is renter occupied, so primarily renters in the San Diego region. And then here you can see some of the most affordable neighborhoods in the San Diego area. So you can see Barrio Logan, Logan Heights, and then some areas closer to the City Heights neighborhood. And then just for a little bit more context around the county, you can see that places like Encinitas have studio apartment rates for around 2,500, whereas Escondido and El Cajon are closer to that 1,500, 1,600 range. Housing from a landlord's perspective, return on investment. I think this is a really important piece to understand how you can present yourself to landlords and really understand where they're coming from to make yourself seem more appealing to potential landlords. All right, so landlords want a good investment. So renting property is a source of investment income, not employment income. So they want something that is very low risk. They want a tenant who has stable income, 2.5 times rent, and can afford a 10% annual increase. That 10% is the maximum allowed annually in the state of California. Someone who pays rent on time, takes care of the property, doesn't disturb neighbors, no conflicts, anything like that, requires little assistance and long-term tenancy. So that they don't have to worry about having a vacant unit or having to go through the lease-up process again. So some landlords are more active in managing their property, but many see it as a passive way to have multiple streams of income. Many hire professional property management companies to handle all of their tenant relations. So many times when we're working with properties, we'll be speaking with someone who isn't actually the property owner, it's just a property manager. And they handle things like management, maintenance, the lease-up process, vacancies, stuff like that. But again, when you're applying or presenting yourself to a landlord or a property manager, you want to present yourself as someone who's very responsible, someone who is a good bet, someone who they don't have to worry about. And then searching for housing in San Diego. Understanding your budget and leveraging your network. Okay, so we just spent a lot of time kind of talking about how expensive and how challenging our rental market is. There are some things within our control, and those are things that we primarily want to focus on. So before you even start your housing search, you should first create a well-organized budget that includes your monthly expenses and all forms of income. So this could be employment income, benefits income, disability income, child support, anything that's documented that can be provided in an application. So then determine how much you're able to spend on housing, including rent, utilities, application fees, pet rent, and security deposit. Moving is a very expensive process, especially initially. There are several programs within the region, whether it's the city or the county, that can help with stuff like that. So definitely do your research on what's available through the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego. The one thing that I do want to stress really hard is that your money goes further with a roommate. So roughly 40% of adult renters in San Diego have a roommate. And you can imagine that we saw earlier that 3% of the market is properties under $1,500 for rent. That's a really small amount of the units available. So you could have a much better time finding something like a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom property, having someone or a couple that you can join a household with, and then you're paying half or a third of what that amount is. And because building property is such a long-term goal for our region, a lot of our local leaders are seeing shared housing roommate situations doubling up as a shorter term solution to help people get into housing. So it really is important to make a consideration. I know that, ideally we would all love our own spaces, be able to have a lot of privacy, but if you find someone who you're able to make it work, it would allow you to a lot more opportunities to rent in different neighborhoods, and it would give you the ability to potentially save some money and put that money towards future housing goals. So even if it might not be ideal initially, maybe you can leverage it so that you're paying a low enough rent so you can channel that extra money towards future housing. And look within your communities, right? Here at San Diego City College, you can go through your friend network, your family network, if you're part of any sort of church groups, you can go through Facebook. There are lots of online roommate matching resources. So see what's out there, and it can maybe have a better outlook than if you were just looking at the very affordable options that are very competitive, right? So if you're submitting an application for like a $1,400, $1,500 studio and have to compete with 30 to 50 more people. Searching online. So primarily things are done online these days. I think it can be really helpful to drive through different neighborhoods to get a sense for what kind of properties do have, for rent or vacant signs, and just get a sense for what the area looks like. But when searching online, I think it's important to understand the difference between aggregated rental listing sites and property management rental listing sites. Aggregated listing sites are like Zillow, Apartments.com, Craigslist, Rent.com, Zumper. And the pros for that are that there's way more options to search for, and there are different ways to search. Whereas the cons are sometimes those listings are outdated. There could be the presence of scams for things like Craigslist, and hard to find contact information. Whereas property management sites like Torrey Pines Property Management or Buchanan Property Management, those are reliable, safe. You can apply directly. They have clear criteria and clear contact information. The cons for those are that there are fewer listings and harder to search in specific neighborhoods, right? So I really recommend using a combination of the two. So maybe use those aggregated listing sites to search for available properties. And then once you see one that is available, go into Google, type in that property name or address, see if it comes up as professionally managed with its own website, and then you can apply directly on that website. It can be hard when you're just going through Apartments.com or Zillow, trying to see which ones are actually still available or anything like that. And make sure, I really want to stress, avoid scams by applying directly on a property management website. Scams are getting a lot more deceiving, a lot easier to fall for. What they do is they take actual listings, take the photos and information from those listings, then they repost them, but with their contact information. So it's important that you never send any money to anyone before seeing the unit in person or confirming ownership of the property. So it's important just to be extra safe there. And then here's an example. So if I were to find the Prado Apartments on this aggregated site, I would then type in the name Prado Apartments or the address into Google and find their actual official property management site. It's hard to see on the screen here, but the phone number on Apartments.com is actually a different number than on the official property website. So it's an example of how you might have a better chance of getting in contact with the property if you use their direct site. And then applying to apartments, friendliness and perseverance. I always recommend calling the property ahead of the application. This is helpful to gather more information as well as make sure that your name stands out during the application process. When you call later after your application is submitted, you'll sound more familiar. Maybe you talked with someone at the leasing office and can have a more robust conversation. The first thing that I like to do when I contact the property is I ask if the unit is currently available and the listing price is correct. You don't want to spend a bunch of time introducing yourself only to find that the listing is no longer available or is outside of your price range. So that's a good place to start. Then I would probably recommend introducing yourself. Just tell them a little about yourself, maybe your job and how quickly you're looking to move in. Ask about their rental criteria, ask about the application process. Do they do an in-person application, online application? Do they recommend that you come tour the unit beforehand? And in that case, you can always ask, obviously, if the unit is available to tour in person. And then ask about any specifics, if you have a pet or any ADA accommodations needed. And then call the property a day or two after the application is submitted. We want to be polite, but we want to be persistent, right? We want to make sure that if we do receive a denial, we say, thank you so much for your time. But if it's still throughout the application process, you can make sure to follow up It can sometimes take a 4 to 5 day process, but it's always nice for them to know that you're serious and interested. And then understanding your barriers. Some common barriers for approval are poor credit, poor rental history, low income, eviction, criminal background, and pets. We obviously don't like to think of our pets as a barrier, but when many properties don't allow for pets, it can sometimes definitely feel like a barrier. Yeah, so some of the ways that you can work around this is to write a letter of explanation, talking more about your situation. Sometimes a situation that comes up where you had a medical emergency 5 years ago and you had medical debt that you had trouble paying off and it caused your credit score to lower. Talk about that, explain it, and try and be genuine and heartfelt about your experience and how you're working on improving your credit. It's not always going to work, but it gives them the opportunity to cut you a break or be flexible, right? So writing a letter that you can include in your application, providing some background about why there was, something on your criminal background or why you have no rental history. Maybe you're a younger student and you don't have a whole lot of rental history because you've been living with your family, or maybe you've been helping family members and living with them, so you don't have a great rental history. Providing that kind of context can make a difference when trying to get an approval. It's also sometimes easier to approach these kinds of barriers with kind of smaller mom and pop landlords. Sometimes when you're working with big property management firms, they're more strict. If something comes up, then they'll say, hey, we can't make exceptions or something like that. So sometimes you'll have a better chance with mom and pop landlords. But again, it's always nice to have a way to tell your story and get comfortable telling your story, I think is important. And I think one of the most important things is don't get discouraged, right? Finding housing can be a challenging journey. It's really competitive, but an application denial can help inform you how to take future steps in future applications. So you can maybe get letters of recommendation, other sorts of kind of things that you can include in your application to give you a better shot. So make sure that even if you get a denial, that you kind of keep moving forward, seeing how you can adjust, strategize, and find potential solutions. And that's what I have for today. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Do my best.